The gavel hit the bench with finality. Custody is hereby granted to the maternal grandmother. Judge Aria Chambers had barely finished speaking when Marcus Harrington's face twisted with rage. "How you don't know who you're messing with, girl?" he snarled, lunging across the courtroom barrier. His fist connected with her right arm with a sickening crack that echoed through the stunned courtroom. Security Officer Reginald Warren tackled the wealthy businessman to the marble floor as 8-year-old Willow screamed from the gallery. "This city won't be run by people like you," Marcus roared, his face contorted with fury. Judge Chambers, clutching her throbbing arm, maintained her composure. "Mr. Harrington, you're under arrest for assault on a judicial officer." What nobody in that courtroom realized was that this explosive moment of violence would expose a web of abuse, corruption, and systemic racism that had been festering for years and transform child protection laws forever. If you believe that no one should be above the law, regardless of wealth or connections, type Justice. Hamilton County Family Court buzzed with its usual morning chaos, but Judge Aria Chambers maintained her characteristic calm as she reviewed the day's most challenging case. At 34, she had already earned respect as the district's youngest family court judge, though not everyone appreciated her thorough approach to child welfare. The Harrington custody case sat atop her stack. 8-year-old Willow Harrington, orphaned by her mother's sudden death 6 months prior, now caught between her paternal father Marcus and maternal grandmother Dorothy. On paper, it seemed straightforward. Marcus Harrington, successful businessman and pillar of the community, seeking custody of his biological daughter. Dorothy Jenkins, retired teacher living on Social Security, arguing for guardianship. But something felt wrong. Aria had learned to trust her instincts during her 15 years as a child advocate attorney before taking the bench. The medical report showed too many accidents: a broken wrist from falling off her bike, bruised ribs from tumbling downstairs, recurring nightmares that required therapy. Marcus Harrington strode into her courtroom like he owned it, his expensive suit and gold watch catching the fluorescent light. His legal team, led by Preston and Associates, the city's most prestigious firm, filled an entire row. Dorothy Jenkins sat alone, except for a court-appointed attorney who looked fresh out of law school. "Your Honor," began Marcus's lead counsel, Richard Preston III, his voice dripping with practiced confidence, "my client is a devoted father who has built his construction company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He can provide young Willow with every advantage: private schools, college fund, stability." The subtle emphasis on stability wasn't lost on Aria. She'd heard the coded language before, the implication that a black judge might not understand family values or traditional family structures. Aria observed Marcus throughout the initial hearing. He smiled at appropriate moments, nodded sympathetically when discussing his daughter's trauma, and presented himself as the grieving widower fighting for his child. But his eyes never quite reached his smile, and Aria noticed how Willow seemed to shrink whenever he approached. "Mr. Harrington," Aria addressed him directly, "tell me about your relationship with Willow before her mother's passing." A flash of something, irritation, control, crossed his features before the practiced mask returned. "We had a normal father-daughter relationship, Your Honor. Lisa and I shared custody informally. Willow spent weekends with me, holidays, summer vacations." "And how is Willow adjusting to living with you full-time now?" "It's been an adjustment, naturally. She's grieving her mother. But children are resilient, and I believe consistency and structure will help her heal." The words sounded rehearsed, lacking genuine emotion. Aria made notes, already planning to speak with Willow privately. What happened next would confirm Judge Chambers' worst fears. The signs were there, but what happened next would confirm Judge Chambers' worst fears. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Aria's chambers. Judge William Thornfield, the court's most senior member, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A power play Aria recognized immediately. "Aria, we need to talk about the Harrington case," Thornfield said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from her desk. At 62, he'd presided over family court for 25 years and made no secret of his belief that some cases required more experienced handling. "What about it, Bill?" "Marcus Harrington is a prominent businessman." He's contributed significantly to the court building fund, sponsors the annual charity gala. This case needs delicate handling. Arya set down her pen and looked directly at him. Are you suggesting I can't handle a custody case? Of course not. But you're young and this particular situation involves complex family dynamics. Perhaps Judge Morrison would be better suited. Judge Morrison is handling criminal cases this month, Arya interrupted, and I've successfully managed hundreds of custody cases. Thornfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm simply thinking about what's best for everyone involved. The child, the family, the court's reputation. After he left, Arya sat quietly for several minutes. She'd faced this before. The suggestion that she was too young, too inexperienced, too something. The something was never explicitly stated, but she understood. A young black woman challenging the decisions of powerful white men made people uncomfortable. Her assistant, Maria Santos, knocked and entered with the day's schedule. Judge Chambers. The local news wants a comment on the Harrington case. What are they saying? Maria hesitated. The headline is, Respected Businessman Battles for Daughter's Custody. They're portraying it as a devoted father fighting an uphill battle. Arya wasn't surprised. The media narrative was already being shaped. Successful businessman versus... what? They hadn't explicitly criticized her yet, but she could read between the lines. That afternoon, during the second custody hearing, Richard Preston III's approach became more aggressive. Your Honor, my client questions whether this court is approaching this case with appropriate objectivity. Excuse me, Counselor. No disrespect intended, but Mr. Harrington simply wants assurance that personal biases won't influence judicial decisions regarding his family. The courtroom fell silent. Arya felt the familiar burn of controlled anger, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Preston, are you questioning this court's impartiality? Not questioning, Your Honor. Simply noting that some judges might bring personal experiences or perspectives that could cloud judgment in family matters. The racial coding was subtle but unmistakable. Arya had heard variations of this throughout her career, the suggestion that her identity somehow disqualified her from making fair decisions about white families. Counselor, this court's only bias is toward the best interests of children. I suggest you focus your arguments on evidence rather than questioning judicial competence. But Marcus Harrington was watching her intently, his expression calculating. He leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, never taking his eyes off Arya. After court, Dorothy Jenkins approached with her attorney. The elderly woman looked exhausted but determined. Judge Chambers, I know I don't have fancy lawyers or money, but I raised Lisa. I know what that man did to her, and I won't let him do it to Willow. Mrs. Jenkins, what do you mean? The accidents, the broken bones, the fear in that child's eyes. Lisa tried to leave him multiple times, but he always found ways to get her back. The custody arrangement, the money, the threats. She died trying to protect Willow. Arya felt a chill. Do you have evidence of abuse? Nothing that would hold up in court. He's too smart, too connected. But that little girl is terrified, and everyone's too busy being impressed by his money to notice. Judge Chambers knew she was walking into dangerous territory, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. Judge Chambers knew she was walking into dangerous territory, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. Arya scheduled an in-camera interview with Willow, a private meeting in her chambers designed to assess the child's well-being without the intimidation of a formal courtroom setting. She decorated one corner of her office with comfortable chairs, children's books, and soft lighting specifically for such conversations. Willow entered hesitantly, holding her grandmother's hand. The 8-year-old was small for her age, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and clothes that seemed too formal for a child, a navy dress with white collar that looked more like a uniform than casual wear. Hi Willow, I'm Judge Chambers. You can call me Judge Arya if that's easier. Would you like to sit on the couch or the chair? The child chose the edge of the couch, perched as if ready to run. Dorothy sat nearby, offering silent support. Willow, I want to talk with you about your living situation. There are no wrong answers, and you're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe and happy. Can you tell me about your home with your daddy? Willow glanced at her grandmother before speaking softly. It's It's okay. What do you like to do for fun there? I have to be quiet mostly. Daddy works a lot and he gets angry when there's noise. Arya made notes carefully, keeping her expression neutral. What happens when he gets angry? The child's shoulders tensed. He says I need to learn discipline. That I'm too much like Mommy. How does he teach discipline? Long pause. Willow's eyes filled with tears. Sometimes he grabs really hard. It leaves marks, but he says that's normal for daddies who care about teaching right from wrong. The familiar pattern emerged through gentle questioning. Accidents that were actually punishments. Isolation presented as protection. Fear disguised as respect. Marcus had been careful. Never injuries that couldn't be explained. Never bruises where others would see. Always with plausible explanations. Willow, the marks on your arms and legs. Can you tell me how they happened? I fall a lot, she recited, clearly practiced. Daddy says I'm clumsy like Mommy was. But when Arya asked about her mother, Willow's whole demeanor changed. Her voice brightened, her posture straightened. Mommy was teaching me to be brave. She said someday we would go live somewhere safe, just the two of us. She was saving money in a secret place. What happened to that plan? Willow's brightness faded. Mommy got sick and died, but she wasn't really sick. She was scared all the time near the end. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the court-appointed child psychologist, joined them for the final portion of the interview. Her subsequent report would be devastating. Clear indicators of ongoing physical and emotional abuse, sophisticated understanding of adult manipulation tactics, unusual for an 8-year-old, and trauma responses consistent with chronic domestic violence exposure. Meanwhile, in the courthouse hallway, Marcus paced outside Arya's chambers like a caged animal. His attorney tried to calm him, but his agitation was visible to anyone passing by. "How long can she keep my daughter in there?" Marcus demanded, his voice carrying despite Preston's attempts to quiet him. "It's routine, Marcus. The judge needs to assess..." "Assess what? I'm her father. I have rights." Court reporter Janet Mills later testified that she heard Marcus mutter, "These people think they can dictate to me how to raise my own child." When Dorothy and Willow finally emerged, Marcus immediately approached his daughter. "How are you doing, sweetheart? Did the nice judge ask you lots of questions?" But Willow instinctively moved closer to her grandmother, and Marcus's jaw tightened. The careful mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Your Honor," Preston addressed Arya as she appeared in her doorway, "my client would like to address the court's concerns directly." "That won't be necessary, Counselor. The court has sufficient information to make an informed decision." Marcus stepped forward without permission. "Judge Chambers, I've built my business on trust and integrity. I love my daughter and want what's best for her." "I'm sure you do, Mr. Harrington. The court will issue its ruling after reviewing all evidence. With respect, Your Honor, I hope personal feelings won't influence your decision about my family." The words hung in the air, another subtle challenge to her objectivity, her right to judge his white family. Arya's voice remained steady, but those who knew her recognized the steel beneath. "Mr. Harrington, this court's only concern is Willow's welfare. Personal feelings have no place in judicial decisions." As security moved to escort him out, Marcus Harrington made a choice that would change everything forever. As security moved to escort him out, Marcus Harrington made a choice that would change everything forever. The courtroom was packed for the custody decision. Word had spread through legal circles that Judge Chambers was preparing to rule against Marcus Harrington, something that rarely happened when wealthy businessmen fought working-class grandmothers for custody. Local media filled the press section. Channel 7's legal correspondent had framed the story as "Young Judge Makes Controversial Custody Decision," already suggesting impropriety before the ruling was announced. Arya took her seat at the bench, acutely aware of the tension in the room. Marcus sat with his legal team, his expression carefully controlled but his hands clenched. Dorothy Jenkins sat with her court-appointed attorney, holding a small photo of her deceased daughter. The court has thoroughly reviewed all evidence, testimony, and expert reports in the matter of Harrington versus Jenkins regarding custody of the minor child Willow Harrington. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft whir of the ventilation system. Child custody decisions represent one of the most solemn responsibilities of this court. Our only consideration is the best interests of the child, guided by evidence rather than assumptions, facts rather than social status. Marcus's attorney shifted uncomfortably. They'd expected their client's wealth and standing to carry significant weight. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell indicates that the minor child has experienced trauma consistent with ongoing emotional and physical abuse. The pattern of injuries documented over the past 18 months, while individually explainable, collectively suggest a concerning pattern. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. This was not what Marcus's supporters had expected. Furthermore, the child's expressed preferences, while not determinative in custody matters, cannot be ignored. Willow has clearly indicated feeling safer with her grandmother and has provided specific, credible accounts of inappropriate discipline that rises to the level of abuse. Marcus's face began to flush red, his careful composure cracking. Mr. Harrington's financial resources are substantial, and his ability to provide material advantages is not in question. However, wealth cannot compensate for an environment where a child lives in fear. Preston leaned over to whisper urgently in Marcus's ear, trying to prevent what he could see coming. Therefore, this court awards temporary custody of Willow Harrington to her maternal grandmother, Dorothy Jenkins, pending a complete investigation by Child Protective Services. Mr. Harrington will be permitted supervised visitation. This is bullshit, Marcus exploded, shooting to his feet. You can't do this. Mr. Harrington, you will control yourself in my courtroom or face contempt charges. But something had snapped. 6 months of careful presentation, expensive legal maneuvering, and strategic community positioning, all destroyed by a young black judge who refused to be impressed by his power and connections. You don't understand the position you're putting yourself in, Marcus said, his voice low and threatening. I built half this city. I know people who can make your career very difficult. Arya's voice cut through the tension like steel. Mr. Harrington, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff Warren, please escort. Don't you dare! Marcus's voice rose to a shout. You think because you're wearing that robe you can destroy my family? You think I don't know what this is about? The racial undercurrent finally surfaced. People like you always think you know what's best for everyone else's children. But this isn't your neighborhood, sweetheart. This is my city. Security Officer Reginald Warren, a 20-year veteran, stepped forward. Sir, you need to leave the courtroom now. I'm not going anywhere until this judge explains why she's taking my daughter away from me. Preston was on his feet, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Your Honor, my client is understandably emotional. Your client is threatening a judicial officer and disrupting court proceedings, Arya replied calmly, though her heart was racing. Mr. Harrington, you have 10 seconds to leave voluntarily, or you will be forcibly removed and charged with contempt. Marcus looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces watching him, the media taking notes, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. The realization seemed to push him over the edge. 10 seconds? He laughed bitterly. You're giving me 10 seconds? Do you know who I am? He began moving toward the bench, his intentions unclear, but his body language increasingly aggressive. Officer Warren moved to intercept, but Marcus was focused entirely on Arya. This isn't over, he said, pointing directly at her. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. As Warren stepped between them, Marcus made a final calculation. If his reputation was already destroyed, if his control was already gone, if this woman had already taken everything that mattered to him, then maybe it was time to show everyone exactly what he was capable of. The courtroom held its collective breath as Marcus Harrington made his choice. As security moved to escort him out, Marcus Harrington made a choice that would change everything forever. As security moved to escort him out, Marcus Harrington made a choice that would change everything forever. The gavel hit the bench with finality. Custody is hereby granted to the maternal grandmother. Judge Arya Chambers had barely finished speaking when Marcus Harrington's face twisted with rage. For a moment, the courtroom was suspended in terrifying silence. Marcus stood frozen, his expensive suit wrinkled from tension, his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. The weight of losing, not just custody but control, respect, the very foundation of his identity, crashed down on him. Preston was still talking, something about appeals and procedural options, but Marcus heard nothing except the roar of blood in his ears. This woman, this judge who didn't understand her place in the natural order, had just destroyed everything he'd worked to maintain. He began walking toward the bench, his movements deliberate and menacing. Officer Warren stepped forward, but Marcus raised his hand in a gesture that seemed peaceful, a man approaching to speak respectfully to the court. "So, Your Honor," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I need you to understand something." Aria remained seated, though every instinct told her to be ready to move. "Mr. Harrington, please return to your seat. Any communications should go through your attorney." "No," Marcus said, continuing his approach. "This is between you and me now." He reached the barrier between the gallery and the bench area, placing both hands on the wooden rail. His knuckles were white with pressure, his face flushed with barely contained rage. "So you don't know who you're messing with, girl," he said, the word girl dripping with dismissive contempt. "You think because you're wearing that robe you can make decisions about my family?" The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone sensing the danger in the air. Willow, sitting in the gallery with her grandmother, began to whimper, a sound she'd learned to make very quietly over years of practice. "Mr. Harrington, you need to—" Aria began. "I need to what?" Marcus exploded, vaulting over the barrier with surprising agility for a man his age. "I need to let some little girl who doesn't understand family values destroy my life?" Officer Warren was moving now, but Marcus was already within reach of the bench. His face contorted with years of accumulated rage, at women who wouldn't submit, at authority figures who couldn't be bought, at a changing world that no longer automatically deferred to white male power. "You want to know what discipline looks like?" he snarled, drawing back his right fist. "Let me show you what happens to people who don't know their place." His punch connected with Aria's right arm as she tried to protect herself, the impact echoing through the courtroom with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent her sideways in her chair, pain radiating from her elbow to her shoulder. "This city won't be run by people like you," Marcus roared, his face contorted with fury and satisfaction at finally expressing what he'd been feeling for months. Officer Warren tackled him from behind, sending both men crashing into the witness stand. Marcus fought like a wild animal, screaming epithets that revealed the depth of his hatred. "Get off me! You don't know who I am. I own half the politicians in this county." As Warren struggled to control him, Marcus managed one final outburst directed at Aria, who was clutching her injured arm but refusing to leave the bench. "This isn't over. You people need to learn that there are consequences for stepping out of line." The racial venom in his voice was unmistakable now, all pretense of civility abandoned. Willow's whimpers had escalated to full sobs, the sound of terror from a child who had witnessed this kind of violence before. Her grandmother held her tightly, but the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen Marcus's true nature revealed in its full, ugly clarity. Court reporter Janet Mills continued recording every word, her fingers flying over the keys, as she documented the complete breakdown of a man who had spent his life believing his wealth and status put him above accountability. Mitchell, the child psychologist, watched from the gallery with professional fascination and personal horror. Years of studying child abuse cases had taught her to recognize the patterns, but seeing the perpetrator's mask slip so completely in public was unprecedented. Judge Chambers, despite the searing pain in her arm, maintained her dignity and authority. As additional security officers arrived to help Warren, she managed to speak clearly. "Mr. Marcus Harrington, you are under arrest for assault on a judicial officer, contempt of court, and terroristic threatening." But the physical attack had just revealed something Judge Chambers had been suspecting all along. As paramedics examined Aria's arm and security officers led Marcus away in handcuffs, the courtroom remained frozen in shock. But for Aria, the pieces of a much larger puzzle were finally clicking into place. The violence hadn't surprised her. It had confirmed everything she'd suspected about Marcus Harrington's character. Men who abused children rarely contained their violence to one victim or one setting. The public explosion of rage was simply the mask slipping, revealing what Willow had been living with for years. "Judge Chambers, we need to get you to the hospital," said paramedic Lisa Rodriguez. "That arm could be broken." "In a moment," Aria replied, her focus on the small figure huddled in her grandmother's arms. "I need to make sure the child is safe first." Willow's reaction to the violence had been the most telling evidence yet. She hadn't been shocked or surprised. She'd been terrified in the way that only comes from experience. This wasn't the first time she'd seen her father explode with physical violence. Dr. Mitchell approached the bench carefully. "Your Honor, I'd like to take Willow somewhere quiet. This has been extremely traumatic for her." But before anyone could move, Willow broke away from her grandmother and ran to the witness stand, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "He does that to me too." The courtroom fell silent again, but this time with a different quality of attention. Every adult present understood the significance of what they'd just heard. "He hits me like that when I don't listen," Willow continued, her 8-year-old voice matter-of-fact in the way children adapt to trauma. "But he says it's not hitting, it's teaching. And he says if I tell anyone, they won't believe me because he's important." Dorothy Jenkins was crying now, years of suspicion confirmed in the most heartbreaking way possible. "Oh, baby girl, Grandma's so sorry. Doctor." Mitchell knelt down to Willow's level. "Sweetie, you're very brave for telling the truth. You're going to be safe now." But Willow's revelations continued, each word building a case that prosecutors would later describe as airtight. "Mommy tried to stop him, but he said if she took me away, he'd make sure we never had anywhere to go. He knows police and judges, and he said they'd believe him instead of us." The sophisticated understanding of adult power dynamics was chilling in someone so young. Marcus had not only abused his daughter physically, but had psychologically manipulated her with detailed explanations of why no one would help her. "He showed me newspaper pictures of Judge Chambers when she started making decisions about our family," Willow added, pointing toward Aria. "He said some people don't understand how families are supposed to work, but he'd teach everyone a lesson." The premeditation was becoming clear. Marcus hadn't just lost control in court. He'd been building toward this confrontation for weeks, his anger festering as a black woman exercised authority over his life in ways he found intolerable. Meanwhile, in the courthouse hallway, Marcus was creating another scene as officers tried to process him. His expensive attorney had abandoned all professional protocol and was screaming at anyone who would listen. "Do you know who you're arresting?" Preston shouted at the officers. "Marcus Harrington built half the commercial district. He employs 300 people. This is a misunderstanding." But the officers had witnessed the assault firsthand. Officer Warren, whose own daughter was about Willow's age, showed no sympathy for Marcus's protests. "Sir, we need you to calm down and comply with the arrest procedure," Warren said professionally, though his jaw was tight with controlled anger. "Calm down? Some judge with an agenda just destroyed my family, and you want me to calm down?" Marcus's voice carried down the hallway, his words growing more reckless with each sentence. "This whole system is rigged against successful people." Court clerk Patricia Henderson, who had worked in the building for 15 years, later testified that she had never seen such a public breakdown of courtroom decorum. Mr. Harrington was screaming about reverse racism and activist judges. He kept saying people like her, and they're taking over. It was very disturbing. Back in the courtroom, Aria finally allowed paramedics to examine her arm. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional impact was more complex. She'd faced discrimination throughout her career, but never such explicit, violent confrontation. Yet looking at Willow, now talking animatedly with Dr. Mitchell about her favorite books instead of cowering in fear, Aria felt a sense of profound satisfaction. The attack had been terrifying, but it had also provided the final piece of evidence needed to protect this child permanently. What they discovered in the next 24 hours would expose a system of abuse that had been hidden for years. What they discovered in the next 24 hours would expose a system of abuse that had been hidden for years. Detective Maria Santos had been investigating domestic violence cases for 12 years, but the Harrington file that landed on her desk was unlike anything she'd encountered. Within hours of Marcus's arrest, her phone began ringing with tips from people who had been afraid to come forward before. "Detective Santos? This is Carol Brennan. I used to work as a nanny for the Harrington family. I need to tell you what I saw. The floodgates had opened. Marcus's public breakdown had given others permission to speak truths they'd been carrying for years. Carol's testimony was damning. I worked there for 6 months when Willow was 5. Mr. Harrington had moods. He would grab Willow hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises on her arms, but always wear clothes would cover them. When I tried to intervene once, he fired me and threatened to make sure I never worked in childcare again. More witnesses emerged throughout the day. Dr. James Peterson, Willow's former pediatrician, admitted he'd suspected abuse, but had been pressured to look the other way. Marcus donated $50,000 to our children's clinic, Dr. Peterson confessed to investigators. When I raised concerns about Willow's injuries, the hospital administration suggested I might be overly suspicious. They reminded me of Mr. Harrington's generosity to the medical center. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus had systematically used his wealth and connections to silence anyone who questioned his treatment of Willow. Lisa Thompson, Willow's former teacher, provided perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony. Willow would come to school with bruises, but always with detailed explanations. I fell down the stairs. I walked into a door. Oh, the stories were too perfect, too practiced. But when I called child services, I was told Mr. Harrington had already contacted them, explaining that his daughter was naturally clumsy and that he was concerned about false accusations from overzealous school personnel. The Child Protective Services records revealed a sophisticated campaign of manipulation. Marcus had proactively contacted CPS multiple times, establishing a narrative of a concerned father dealing with a difficult child and interfering school officials. Even more disturbing, the investigation uncovered Marcus's connections to key figures in the child welfare system. CPS supervisor Robert Hayes had received a substantial donation to his favorite charity from Harrington Construction just months before dismissing concerns about Willow. "It's not illegal," Hayes protested when questioned. "Mr. Harrington supported our youth sports program. That had nothing to do with the case evaluations. But the timing was suspicious, and prosecutors began building a case that extended far beyond simple child abuse. Meanwhile, at Hamilton County Hospital, Judge Aria Chambers was receiving treatment for her injured arm while fielding calls from reporters, attorneys, and fellow judges. The story had exploded beyond the courthouse, becoming a symbol of larger issues about power, privilege, and accountability. "Judge Chambers, this is District Attorney Elizabeth Warren," came the call that would change everything. "We need to discuss expanding the charges against Mr. Harrington. The DA's investigation had uncovered evidence that Marcus's influence campaign extended beyond just protecting himself from abuse allegations. Financial records showed a pattern of donations to local political figures, always followed by favorable zoning decisions, tax assessments, and regulatory approvals for his construction projects. "We're looking at potential corruption charges," DA Warren explained. Marcus used his wealth to create a protection network that enabled not just child abuse, but systematic circumvention of legal oversight. But the most shocking revelation came from Marcus's ex-wife's medical records. Lisa Harrington's cause of death, originally listed as sudden cardiac event, was being reopened for investigation. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had treated Lisa in her final months, came forward with disturbing information. Lisa came to me multiple times with injuries consistent with domestic violence. She was terrified of her husband, but felt trapped because of Willow. She kept saying, "He has too many connections. If I leave, he'll make sure I lose her completely." The medical examiner who had initially ruled Lisa's death natural was Dr. Michael Foster, who had received a substantial equipment donation from Harrington Construction just weeks before Lisa's death. "This case keeps getting bigger," Detective Santos told her supervisor. "We're not just looking at child abuse anymore. We're looking at a systematic corruption network that may have enabled a murder." As news of the expanding investigation spread, more victims found the courage to come forward. Marcus had used his power and wealth to silence a dozen different women and children over the years, always with the same techniques: financial pressure, professional threats, and the manipulation of official systems that were supposed to protect victims. The truth was even worse than Judge Chambers. As news of the expanding investigation spread, more victims found the courage to come forward. Marcus had used his power and wealth to silence a dozen different women and children over the years, always with the same techniques: financial pressure, professional threats, and the manipulation of official systems that were supposed to protect victims. Stories of courage like Judge Chambers inspire people everywhere who believe in protecting children and standing up to discrimination. Comment your country and city so we can see where justice is being celebrated today. The truth was even worse than Judge Chambers had imagined, and the consequences were just beginning. The truth was even worse than Judge Chambers imagined, and the consequences were just beginning. The Hamilton County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. Media vans lined the street, protesters gathered with signs reading "Protect our children," and no one above the law, and victims who had been silent for years finally felt safe enough to speak publicly. Channel 7's narrative had completely reversed. The same reporter who had questioned Judge Chambers' qualifications now stood before cameras declaring, "What we initially reported as a custody dispute has revealed itself to be something far more sinister, a systematic pattern of abuse enabled by corruption at multiple levels of local government." Inside the courthouse, Judge William Thornfield was facing uncomfortable questions from judicial oversight committees. His suggestion that Aria should recuse herself from the Harrington case looked suspiciously like an attempt to protect Marcus from scrutiny. "Judge Thornfield," asked investigator Patricia Morris, "can you explain your relationship with Marcus Harrington outside of court proceedings?" Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Harrington was a prominent community member. He supported various court initiatives, including the renovation of your personal office. That was a donation to the court building fund. A donation made specifically earmarked for your office renovations, totaling $45,000. The web of influence was unraveling rapidly. Financial records showed Marcus had systematically invested in relationships with judges, prosecutors, police officials, and child services personnel. It wasn't traditional bribery, it was something more sophisticated and more insidious." Meanwhile, Aria was back at work despite her arm being in a sling. The physical injury was healing, but the emotional impact had been more complex. She'd received hundreds of letters and emails from abuse survivors sharing their own stories. One letter particularly moved her, from a woman named Jennifer Walsh. "Judge Chambers, I was married to a man like Marcus for 8 years. He never left visible bruises, never did anything witnesses could report, but he systematically destroyed my sense of reality. When I finally tried to leave, he used his connections in law enforcement to have me arrested on false charges. I lost custody of my children for 2 years. Watching you stand up to him in that courtroom gave me hope that the system can work when brave people refuse to be intimidated." Dr. Mitchell's expanded evaluation of Willow revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation the child had endured. "She's been trained to believe that her father's version of reality is the only truth that matters," Dr. Mitchell explained to the court. He convinced her that other adults, teachers, doctors, social workers, were either incompetent or malicious. This level of psychological control is consistent with patterns seen in cults and terrorist organizations. The comparison wasn't hyperbole. Marcus had created a bubble of false reality around his family, systematically discrediting any outside perspective that threatened his control. But the most explosive revelation came from Marcus's business records. Detective Santos discovered that Harrington Construction had been awarded city contracts worth millions of dollars, despite consistently submitting higher bids than competitors. City Councilman Robert Hayes, the same man whose charity had received donations from Marcus, had been instrumental in approving these contracts. The connection wasn't coincidental. "This isn't just about child abuse anymore," District Attorney Warren told her staff. "We're looking at a RICO case, a systematic criminal enterprise that used corruption to enable ongoing crimes against women and children." The federal authorities were now involved. FBI financial crimes specialist Agent Sarah Chen had been assigned to trace the full scope of Marcus's influence network. "In 30 years of investigating white-collar crime, I've rarely seen such systematic corruption at the local level," Agent Chen reported. Marcus Harrington essentially purchased immunity from accountability, using legitimate business donations as cover for what amounts to protection payments. The psychological profile being developed by federal analysts painted Marcus as a sophisticated predator who had weaponized the very systems designed to protect vulnerable people. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Marcus was discovering that his influence had limits. The inmates didn't care about his construction company or his political connections. When news of the child abuse charges spread through the jail population, Marcus found himself in protective custody for his own safety. His attorney, Richard Preston III, was facing his own problems. The State Bar was investigating whether Preston had knowledge of Marcus's systematic intimidation of witnesses and potential obstruction of justice. "My client has been the victim of a rush to judgment," Preston insisted to reporters, but his usual confidence was notably absent. The carefully constructed defense strategy had collapsed when Marcus's public assault provided undeniable evidence of his capacity for violence. Judge Chambers, despite everything she'd endured, felt a profound sense of validation. The system she'd devoted her career to serving was finally working as intended, not perfectly, not without struggle, but ultimately placing justice above privilege and protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. But what came next would prove that justice has no limits when a child's safety is at stake. The courtroom for Marcus Harrington's criminal trial was standing room only. Judge Patricia Williams, brought in from another district to avoid any appearance of bias, presided over what had become the most closely watched criminal trial in Hamilton County history. The charges were staggering: aggravated child abuse, assault on a judicial officer, terroristic threatening, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Federal prosecutors had added RICO charges related to his systematic corruption of local officials. Lead prosecutor David Martinez opened with devastating directness. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power, how it can be abused, how it can corrupt, and what happens when someone believes they are above the law." The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Dr. Mitchell testified about Willow's psychological trauma, comparing her symptoms to those of prisoners of war. Medical experts documented years of injuries that formed a clear pattern of escalating abuse. But the most powerful testimony came from Willow herself, now 8 months removed from her father's control and visibly healthier. The court had arranged for her to testify via closed-circuit television to minimize trauma, but her words carried devastating clarity. "My daddy taught me that telling the truth was only good if it made him look good," Willow said in her small, clear voice. "He said other adults would lie about him because they were jealous of how successful he was." Prosecutor Martinez asked gently, "Willow, can you tell the jury about the times your father hurt you? He would grab my arms really tight and shake me when I didn't listen fast enough. He said it wasn't hitting because he used his hands, not his fists, but it hurt and it left purple marks." The jury watched in riveted silence as this child, with devastating innocence, described years of systematic abuse disguised as discipline. "Did you tell anyone about being hurt?" "I tried to tell my teacher once, but Daddy found out. He said if I told lies about him again, he would make sure Grandma Dorothy couldn't see me anymore. He showed me papers that proved he could do that." The sophistication of the psychological manipulation was evident to everyone in the courtroom. Marcus hadn't just abused his daughter, he'd systematically destroyed her ability to seek help. Marcus's defense team, now led by a different firm after Preston recused himself, attempted to portray the incident as an isolated moment of poor judgment by a grieving father under extreme stress. "My client lost his wife," defense attorney Catherine Moore argued. "He was facing the possibility of losing his daughter. In a moment of overwhelming emotion, he made a terrible mistake. But that doesn't make him the monster the prosecution has painted." But when Marcus took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed the same arrogance and sense of entitlement that had led to his downfall. "Judge Chambers was clearly biased against me from the beginning," Marcus testified. "A young, inexperienced judge making decisions about complex family situations she couldn't understand." Even under oath, even facing decades in prison, Marcus couldn't resist the coded language that revealed his true beliefs about who deserved authority in society. "Did you strike Judge Chambers?" Prosecutor Martinez asked during cross-examination. "I was defending myself and my family from a corrupt system." "That wasn't the question. Did you strike Judge Chambers?" Long pause. "I may have acted defensively when I felt threatened." "You felt threatened by a woman sitting behind a bench." "I felt threatened by the abuse of judicial power." The jury's faces showed their disgust. Marcus's inability to take responsibility, even when caught on camera committing assault, demonstrated exactly the kind of character that had enabled years of child abuse. When Judge Aria Chambers took the stand, the courtroom was completely silent. Her arm had healed, but the emotional impact of the attack had crystallized her understanding of why she'd chosen to dedicate her career to protecting children. "Mr. Harrington's assault on me was shocking, but it wasn't surprising," Aria testified. "Men who abuse children often react violently when their control is challenged. The attack confirmed everything I had observed about his character and his treatment of his daughter." "Were you afraid?" Martinez asked. "In the moment, yes. But more than fear, I felt determined. That little girl had been living with that violence her entire life. If I could help stop it by enduring one attack, it was worth it." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause that Judge Williams allowed to continue for a full minute. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his face had the grey pallor of a man finally confronting the consequences of his actions. The jury's decision would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the future of child protection in the entire county. The jury's decision would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the future of child protection in the entire county. Stories of courage like Judge Chambers inspire people everywhere who believe in protecting children and standing up to discrimination. Comment your country and city so we can see where justice is being celebrated today. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the trial. Victims' rights advocates, child protection specialists, and legal professionals had traveled from across the state to witness what many were calling a watershed moment for accountability in cases involving wealthy defendants. Judge Patricia Williams took her time reviewing the pre-sentencing reports, victim impact statements, and psychological evaluations before addressing the packed courtroom. "Mr. Harrington, you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the heart of our legal system and our moral obligations to protect the most vulnerable members of society." Marcus sat motionless at the defense table, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usual arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had finally run out of options and influence. "The court has received over 200 victim impact statements, not just from your daughter, but from other women and children who suffered because of your systematic abuse of power and authority." One by one, Judge Williams detailed the scope of Marcus's crimes. Not just the physical abuse of Willow, but the corruption that had enabled it, the intimidation of witnesses, the manipulation of public officials, and the psychological terrorism he had inflicted on multiple victims over decades. Your assault on Judge Chambers was not an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the inevitable result of a lifetime spent believing that your wealth and status placed you above accountability. Dorothy Jenkins, now Willow's legal guardian, had been given permission to read a victim impact statement on behalf of her granddaughter. Willow wants everyone to know that she's not afraid anymore. She's learning to trust adults again. She's making friends at school, and she's discovered that she loves to paint. But she also wants people to understand that there are other children living the way she used to live, and she hopes her courage to tell the truth will help them too. The statement brought tears to eyes throughout the courtroom, including those of several jury members who had remained to witness the sentencing. Dr. Mitchell presented an updated psychological evaluation of Willow. This child has made remarkable progress in recovery, but the trauma she endured will require ongoing therapy for years to come. However, her resilience and the support system now in place give every reason for optimism about her future. Judge Williams then turned to the sentences, which would become precedent-setting in their scope. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, 15 years in state prison. On the charge of assault on a judicial officer, 5 years to run consecutively. On the charges related to witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, 10 years to run consecutively. On the federal RICO charges, 20 years in federal prison. The mathematics was stark. Marcus Harrington would spend the next 50 years in prison, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Additionally, the court orders the defendant to pay restitution, totaling $3 million to his victims, and to establish a fund for child protection services in Hamilton County. The financial penalty would effectively dismantle Marcus's business empire, ensuring that the wealth he had used to enable abuse would now be redirected toward protecting other children. As bailiffs prepared to escort Marcus to begin his prison sentence, he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I want to say something to my daughter." Judge Williams hesitated, then nodded. "Willow, if you're watching this, I want you to know." He paused for nearly 30 seconds, struggling with words. "I want you to know that what happened wasn't your fault. I was wrong, and you were right to tell the truth." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of responsibility Marcus had offered throughout the entire legal process. Meanwhile, in Judge Chambers' office, Aria was preparing for what had become a daily ritual, reading letters from abuse survivors and child protection advocates from around the country. Her decision to stand firm against intimidation had become a symbol of judicial courage that resonated far beyond Hamilton County. The National Association of Women Judges had awarded her their annual Courage Award. The American Bar Association had invited her to keynote their Child Protection Conference. Law schools were requesting her to speak about judicial independence under pressure. But the recognition that meant the most came in a hand-drawn card from Willow. "Thank you, Judge Aria, for keeping me safe. Love, Willow." The card showed a stick-figure judge with a superhero cape, standing next to a little girl who was finally smiling. The real transformation was just beginning, and its impact would be felt for generations. But the real transformation was just beginning, and its impact would be felt for generations. 6 months after Marcus Harrington began serving his 50-year sentence, the Hamilton County Courthouse looked different. New security protocols were in place, but more importantly, new procedures had been implemented to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had enabled Marcus's crimes. The most significant change came in the form of legislation that would become known as the Willow Protection Act, comprehensive reform that required mandatory reporting training for all court personnel, established independent oversight of child welfare cases, and created severe penalties for using financial influence to obstruct child protection investigations. Governor Sarah Martinez signed the bill in a ceremony at the State House, with Judge Chambers, Dorothy Jenkins, and 9-year-old Willow in attendance. This legislation ensures that no child will suffer in silence, while adults with power and money manipulate the system that should protect them, Governor Martinez declared. Willow's courage and Judge Chambers' determination have changed the law for children across our entire state. But the changes went far deeper than legislation. The Hamilton County Child Protection Center had been completely restructured, with new leadership, independent funding, and protocols designed to prevent the kind of influence peddling that Marcus had used to silence concerns about Willow. Dr. Patricia Williams, the new director, had implemented revolutionary changes. We now have mandatory cross-referencing of all child abuse reports with financial records of suspected perpetrators. If someone is making substantial donations to officials involved in their case, that triggers automatic independent review. The training programs instituted after the Harrington case were becoming models for other jurisdictions. Judge Thornfield, facing his own disciplinary proceedings, had been required to complete 60 hours of education on recognizing and responding to domestic violence and child abuse. More importantly, the cultural change was evident in results. In the year following Marcus's conviction, child abuse reports in Hamilton County increased by 40%. Not because abuse was increasing, but because people finally felt safe reporting it. Lisa Chen, a teacher at Willow School, exemplified this change. Before the Harrington case, we were afraid to report suspected abuse if the family was wealthy or connected. Now we know the system will take us seriously and investigate thoroughly regardless of who's involved. The ripple effects extended throughout the legal system. 3 judges had resigned or been removed for accepting inappropriate gifts from parties with cases before their courts. 2 prosecutors had been disciplined for failing to properly investigate child abuse cases. The entire culture of deference to wealth and status was being systematically dismantled. Judge Chambers had been promoted to Chief Judge of the Family Court, a position she used to implement comprehensive reforms in how the system handled vulnerable children and families. The Harrington case taught us that corruption isn't always obvious bribes in backrooms, Aria explained to a national conference of judges. Sometimes it's the subtle pressure to look the other way, the suggestion that certain families deserve special consideration, the implication that challenging powerful people is bad for your career. We have to be vigilant against all forms of influence that compromise our obligation to protect children. The physical changes to the courthouse were symbolic of deeper transformations. The new Children's Advocacy Center was named the Aria Chambers Center for Child Protection, featuring specialized interview rooms, on-site therapy services, and protocols designed to minimize trauma for child witnesses. But perhaps the most powerful testimony to change came from the children themselves. Over the past year, 17 children had been removed from abusive situations using the new protocols and procedures developed after the Harrington case. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez was one of them. His father, a prominent attorney, had been systematically abusing him while using his legal connections to avoid scrutiny. The new independent review process caught patterns that might previously have been overlooked. Tommy is thriving now, reported his therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the same woman who had written to Judge Chambers after Marcus's assault. He's in a safe foster home. He's doing well in school, and he's beginning to trust adults again. The Willow Protection Act literally saved his life. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had adopted Hamilton County's new protocols as a model for other jurisdictions. Training materials based on the Harrington case were being used in law schools across the country. Judge Williams, now overseeing the expanded child protection system, reflected on the broader implications. What we learned is that protecting children requires more than good intentions. It requires systems designed to resist corruption, procedures that prioritize child welfare over adult comfort, and the courage to confront powerful people when children's lives are at stake. One moment of violence had exposed a truth that would protect countless children, but the story's greatest impact was still to come. One moment of violence had exposed a truth that would protect countless children, but the story's greatest impact was still to come. 3 years had passed since that explosive day in Judge Chambers' courtroom. The Hamilton County Family Court was hosting its annual Bring Your Child to Work Day, and among the young visitors was 10-year-old Willow Harrington, now legally Willow Jenkins, having taken her grandmother's name. She walked through the courthouse with the confident stride of a child who had learned she was worthy of protection and respect. Her blonde hair was longer now, pulled back in a ponytail secured with a bright purple scrunchie. Most importantly, her eyes held the light that had been missing during those dark years with her father. "Grandma Dorothy, can we visit Judge Aria's courtroom?" Willow asked, tugging on her grandmother's hand. Dorothy Jenkins, now 68 and officially retired from teaching, spent her days as Willow's full-time guardian. The transition had been supported by a victim compensation fund established as part of Marcus's restitution, a final irony that his own money was now providing for the child he had harmed. "Of course, sweetheart. Judge Chambers would love to see you." Aria was between hearings when her clerk announced the special visitors. The sight of Willow, healthy, happy, and clearly thriving, never failed to remind her why she had chosen this profession. "Willow, look how much you've grown." Aria came around from behind the bench, careful not to make her greeting too formal or intimidating. "Judge Aria, I brought something to show you," Willow said, pulling a carefully folded paper from her backpack. "It's my essay for school about heroes." The essay, written in careful 10-year-old handwriting, was titled "The Judge Who Saved Me." But beyond the personal story, it revealed a mature understanding of justice, courage, and standing up for what's right. "I learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Willow had written. "It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. Judge Chambers was probably scared when my father hit her, but she didn't let that stop her from protecting me and other kids. As Arya read, Willow explained her current life with the enthusiasm of a normal 10-year-old. She was taking art classes, playing soccer, and had been chosen for the school's advanced reading program. Her nightmares had stopped completely, and Dr. Mitchell had reduced her therapy sessions to once monthly for maintenance. "The best part," Willow confided, "is that I'm not afraid of adults anymore. I know that if someone tries to hurt me, there are people who will believe me and help me." That simple statement represented the fundamental transformation the Harrington case had achieved. Children throughout Hamilton County, and increasingly throughout the state, now lived with the knowledge that the system would protect them, regardless of their abuser's wealth or status. Dorothy shared updates on the broader family. "We heard from the prison that Marcus completed a violence intervention program. He wrote a letter asking if Willow wanted any contact, but she decided she wasn't interested. She said she has all the family she needs." It was a healthy decision from a child who had learned to trust her own instincts and set appropriate boundaries. After Willow and Dorothy left to continue their courthouse tour, Arya sat quietly in her chambers, reflecting on the case that had changed her life and career. The physical scar from Marcus's attack had faded, but the experience had crystallized her understanding of both the power and the responsibility that came with judicial authority. Her desk was covered with letters from other judges who had faced similar challenges: pressure to give special consideration to wealthy defendants, subtle threats about career consequences, the constant navigation between justice and politics. The Harrington case had become a touchstone for judicial courage, proving that standing firm against intimidation was both possible and necessary. The afternoon brought news of another victory. The state Supreme Court had upheld the Willow Protection Act against constitutional challenges, ensuring that the reforms would remain permanent. Child advocacy groups across the nation were implementing similar protocols, creating a network of protection that extended far beyond Hamilton County. As evening approached and the courthouse emptied, Arya reviewed her calendar for the following day. 3 custody cases, 2 adoption hearings, and a child protection matter that would require careful attention. Each case represented a family in crisis, children who needed advocates, adults who needed guidance. But she faced the work with renewed confidence, knowing that the system she served had been strengthened by the courage of one small girl and the determination of everyone who had refused to let wealth and power triumph over justice. The final impact would change everything forever, proving that when good people stand firm against corruption and abuse, transformation is not only possible, but inevitable. Thank you to everyone who typed justice, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for child protection and racial justice means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and transformation. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.